So we'll go ahead and get started. Hopefully everybody's in advanced soils. If not, there's other classrooms downstairs. So these microphones really aren't for this room because it's not big enough. It's more so for the virtual folks and for our recording. So this is Dan Schwartz. He's going to be doing our talk today. So Dan holds a bachelor's and a master's degree in environmental science from the University of Maryland and Virginia Tech. Since 2003, Dan has worked as a soil scientist for the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District. His first years with the district were spent outdoors doing field work to update the Fairfax County soils map. Since then, his work responsibilities have broadened to include outreach and education, technical consultation to county agencies, soil and stormwater research, erosion and drainage assistance to landowners, and implementation of the district's residential grant programs. So we'll have 45 minutes for Dan's presentation and about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A afterwards. Dan.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Sorry, I should back check. Control. Okay. All right, so good to see everybody here today. It's always good to hang out with fellow soil nerds on a weekend. Everybody wants to hear about dirt on their Saturday, but the fact that we've got a fairly full room here and probably some people online as well too makes me realize there's other people out there who have an affinity for soil just like I do. When it comes to soil, what grows on top is fairly obvious. We can tell when we have good results, but it can be a little bit tougher for us to figure out why exactly that is, because it's what's going on below, out of sight, just below our feet, in the near soil surface, just underneath the ground surface, that really is the impetus for driving this type of material, this type of growth that we can see. So what do we look for when, we're looking at what's growing on top, but we really have to figure out what's going on down below. Next slide, please. And in many cases, it's not. We think of soil kind of in the physical sense, your sand, silt, your clay percentage, your water, your oxygen. Those things are all important as well, too. But a lot of it's the biology that's in the soil. That's what we really need to concentrate on. Without a healthy ecosystem down in the soil, we're not going to have healthy plant growth. Without a good home, a habitat that is providing these critters, bacteria, fungi, arthropods, things like that, the resources they need, the energy sources they need, the carbon they need, the nutrients they need, we're not going to be getting carbon, nutrients, and energy to our plants that they need as well, too. So in some ways, when we're managing soil, we think of it as managing plants, but we're not really managing plants. We're managing these guys. And if we can manage these guys well, keep them happy, they're going to do the hard work of prepping a good soil habitat that will keep our plants happy. So in many ways, we're sort of like little microbiologists, if you will. A good gardener is a good microbiologist. A good landscaper is a good microbiologist. Somebody who can keep these guys happy is going to have good results growing whatever it is that you want to grow, whether it's garden crops like tomatoes and cucumbers, or our native plants. Next slide. The issue in areas around here is, of course, urbanization. And you just have to look outside to see urbanization in action. We've got these data centers going up around the campus here, big cranes, big machinery, pretty much everywhere you look around this campus. When soil is urbanized, it changes. It changes many of its functions. It changes many of its characteristics. In almost all cases, those changes are fairly negative, meaning they hurt the functioning of the soil. They make that soil a less suitable habitat for those little microbes and other critters that are growing down underneath our feet that create the good habitat for plants, the good medium for plant growth. Next slide. To show you some of the examples, my office did a study in Arlington County at the county government's behest a couple of years ago. It was a fairly small study, but I think the results are fairly illuminating about what kind of effects urbanization has on the characteristics of soil. So what Arlington wanted us to look at was old properties, and by old I mean 50s, 60s era houses, so some of the early suburban houses that went up in Arlington when it started to really become a bedroom community of DC. And brand new houses, houses that were either just about to complete construction, were finished with construction, but had not yet been sold to the first owner, to the first resident. So they're big, empty, brand new houses that haven't been moved into yet. These are two of the example sites. So there's, one of our older houses from the 50s. Here's one of our new ones that got finished in 2020. And the county wanted us to look at the soil and the lawn, both in the front yard and the backyard, and to look at characteristics like density, the infiltration rate, which is the rate at which water absorbs down into the soil, the organic matter content, the topsoil depth. And we looked at a few other things as well too, but I think these numbers are fairly illuminating. So we look at the new versus the old properties. We found that these brand new properties, their density was about 1.37 grams per centimeter cubed. The old ones, 1.15 grams per centimeter cubed. Not a huge difference, but certainly an increase for those new properties. The infiltration rate was very interesting. New properties, 0.13 inches per hour, about a tenth of an inch per hour. Almost no infiltration, basically. The old properties, 1.28 inches per hour. Not great, but certainly not terrible. It's not as fast as you would find in a really healthy forest soil, but for the most part, 90% of our rainfall is less than an inch. So unless it comes in a really fast burst, those old properties will be able to absorb most of that rainfall that we see throughout the year. New properties, not so much. And actually, this is the reason that Arlington had us come out to take a look at the soil. They were getting a lot of complaints from the neighbors of these new properties saying, oh, this new house went up and now my yard's flooding. Well, why is that? Perhaps it's because that lot isn't as porous as it used to be. The organic matter content, we looked at the top 4 inches of soil. The new properties had an organic matter content of 1.7%. The old properties, 3.5%. Neither of these are particularly great numbers, but certainly 3.5 is better than 1.7. And then topsoil depth. The new properties had an average 1 inch topsoil depth. The old properties, 3 inches. So you can see there's some serious changes in all of these parameters when we move from the new, brand-new, fresh developed properties to properties that have been lived in for 60 or 70 years. Next slide, please. And the reason that these changes, we'll kind of take a step back. We'll get into these changes and some of the reasons for them. But I think to understand the reasons that these things change, these characteristics change when a soil is developed or urbanized or suburbanized, you have to understand what soil is in the first place. A lot of people kind of have a misconception about soil. We think of it as a solid, and that's not wrong. There's a lot of solids in soil. It's the plurality of soil. The majority of soil is solid. But there's a lot of other things in there as well, too, that are equally important. So Professor Talamy was just mentioning soil, or sort of the living area that we have on Earth is sort of like the eggshell on top of the egg. That's soil. That's basically what he's talking about is soil. It's stuff growing in the soil or on the soil. That's that living eggshell. So I think of the soil very similarly, not an eggshell, but the skin of the earth. But same kind of analogy. It's that thin layer right on the outside of the planet where a lot of life occurs. This is also where a lot of important but very differing forms of matter intersect. So call them the 3 spheres. We've got the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and the atmosphere. And soil is where all 3 of those spheres intersect. What is our hydrosphere? That's all of our water. Potomac River, the Atlantic Ocean, to the really small stuff, the little feeder streams, ephemeral streams that flow into those, groundwater, little microscopic particles of water vapor up in our clouds and in our air. All of that is our hydrosphere. There's the lithosphere, which is the solid rock and the sediments that weather from that solid rock. So no matter where you are in the world, if you dig down deep enough, you will eventually hit solid rock. You will hit bedrock. Around here in Prince William, you guys are sort of unlucky when it comes to gardening. You only have to dig down in eastern Prince William County about 2 to 4 feet to hit bedrock. We've got very shallow soils around here. I'm not exactly sure why it has to do with the bedrock. I don't know why it doesn't form deeper soils, but it's what you got, 2 to 4 feet. We go 20 miles east of here into Alexandria, eastern Arlington, next to the Potomac. You might have to dig down 1,000 feet before you hit bedrock. So there's a big change from spot to spot. It doesn't take a huge change in distance or geography to find real big changes in bedrock depth. But the rule is no matter where you are, you dig down deep enough, you will hit solid bedrock. And then, of course, there's all the sediments that are weathering off that solid bedrock, kind of building up on top of it. That's all part of the lithosphere. So that's the solid stuff. And then there's the atmosphere, pretty self-explanatory. That's the air above us, the air that we're breathing right now. Of course, when it hits the soil, some of that atmosphere does percolate down into the soil as well, too, through pores and open spaces. And where we have those 3 spheres intersecting, that's where we get soil. Next slide, please. So what you will see is that if we look at a pie chart of healthy soil, it really shows us the importance of these 3 spheres. It's not a solid material. It's about 50% solid, only about half solid. I should say this is healthy soil as well, too. Non-healthy soil will have a different dispersion, but your general healthy soil is about 50% solid material. 25% of the volume of the healthy soil is air. and 25% is water. The air is going to be exactly the same as our atmosphere, but it's going to be pretty similar. Generally, it's a little bit lower in oxygen content just because there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of respiration going on in soil, and it's a little bit separated from the atmosphere itself, so it doesn't diffuse as evenly and clearly as air in a room like this would. And of course, these numbers change. We have a big rainfall. That's the soils. The next day is going to be pretty much 50% water, 50% solid. We go into July, we have a couple weeks of really hot, dry weather. A lot of that water is going to disappear, and you're going to have a much more air-filled soil. But on average, this is what your healthy soil is going to look like. A couple clicks. I think I got some animations on here. If we want to break it down a little bit further, that solid material is about 5% organic by volume, 45% mineral. Mineral being our sands, our silt, clays. Development causes a lot of changes in these soils as we go. So when we take a site and we decide to develop it, it comes with a lot of physical changes because we bring in heavy equipment, backhoes, bulldozers, things like that. We grade out the site, we pack down that soil, which in some cases you do want packed down soil. You do want compacted soil underneath your house, underneath your roadways. You don't want your foundation settling, obviously. But that's all where you want it. You don't want compacted soil out in your lawn, out where you're trying to plant out in your garden. And unfortunately, with modern construction techniques, almost the whole site does get compacted, for better or for worse. So when a soil is developed, we start off with this nice dispersion of 25% air, 25% water, and 50% solids. And then the bulldozers come in. One more click, there we go. And what happens is those heavy machinery and just the simple action of grading out the soil, pushing it, into a big stockpile on the side so that the foundations can be placed and then the soil is laid back down. That tends to really make a denser material. A lot of those open pore spaces, those nice channels that allow air and water formally into the soil get squeezed out. And we get a much denser substrate as a result. And again, that's good underneath the foundation, underneath the house, but underneath the parking lot and the sidewalk, but pretty much nowhere else. And as a result, this is just an example. I don't know the exact numbers. It's going to change from spot to spot. But obviously, the more soil is compacted, the more it becomes solid. And the less pore space is available to be filled with air and water, which of course is a bad thing for your plants because they want access to oxygen and water. Roots only take up two things from the soil. They take up water, they take up oxygen. They're not taking up little particles of sand, silt, or clay. You say, well, they're taking up nutrients too. True, but those nutrients have to be dissolved in the water in order for the plants to access them. So the only physical things they take up are water, whatever happens to be dissolved in it, and oxygen. One more click. So when we have development, we find a significant loss in pore space. We end up with a soil that's much more solid than what we started with. One more click. One more, please. There we go. So this is what we had originally. This is what we call a well-structured soil. Well-structured soil is basically a soil that naturally clumps together into these little aggregates that we call beds. And between those beds, we have our pore spaces. So when it rains, water can access those pore spaces and absorb pretty quickly down into the soil and get into the rooting zone where the plants then have access to it. After construction, what happens is that same soil is now squished out. The heavy machinery sits down on top of these little soil pads and squeezes them into flat, much more tightly interlocked plates. That's what we call platy structure, which we see very commonly in our urban soils. Same sand, silt, and clay percentage, just less pore space because those nice loose beds that were there before that were separated from their neighboring beds by a big pore space have now been squeezed down together. It's sort of like a biscuit, if you will, but not a flaky biscuit, a very dense biscuit, one you probably wouldn't want to eat, like a hardtack, like the old sailors used to eat back in the 1700s. What happens when it rains on this soil? It becomes what I call an impervious light material. It's not fully impervious like your concrete or your asphalt or your rooftop will be, but it's able to take in significantly less water at a slower rate than the natural soil that was there before because all those pore spaces have been squeezed out and only a few are left and they're generally tighter and smaller. So there's just less ability for water to percolate down into the soil. As a result, a lot more of that water stagnates on the surface, or if you got a little bit of slope, it becomes stormwater runoff. So that's sort of your impervious light. The thing is, impervious material is easy to see. You can see the asphalt and concrete outside. You can grow a healthy stand of green grass on top of compacted soil. So you wouldn't necessarily know from the surface just by looking at it that you have this degraded compacted soil. In some cases, you can see it, but other cases, it's fairly invisible unless you start poking down in the ground and taking actual measurements. So again, what about the results that we found in Arlington point to the evidence of compaction? Well, it's really these first two things. Look at the density. Density goes from 1.37 grams per centimeter cubed in our new houses. Our old houses, it's 1.15 grams per centimeter cubed. One more click. That should be one more. Have a lot of little animations here. About a 19, close to 20% increase. Not huge numbers, but then you look at the infiltration rate. Two more clicks there. The infiltration rate goes from 0.13 inches per hour in our new soils. It used to be 1.28 inches per hour on average in our old soils. It's 90% reduction. These new soils, even though the density hasn't increased by a tremendous amount, the ability of these soils to absorb water has really decreased. And this is a problem because our stormwater laws statewide are directed at impervious surfaces. You build a new house like this, you are required by law, by Virginia state law, to control the runoff off the impervious surfaces, the roof, the asphalt, the concrete, whatever it might be. You're not required to control any runoff off the lawn because the assumption is it was lawn before, it's lawn now, it's going to be absorbing water just like it was. But really, in effect, you're almost putting concrete on that lawn itself. It's absorbing a bit more than concrete would, certainly, but not all that much more. So a property like this property had rain gardens to absorb the runoff from the roof and from the driveway. A lot of the properties we looked at had permeable driveways, all fine and good. The developers were following the rules, but then there's this compacted lawn that's shedding a tremendous amount of runoff onto the neighbors, out into the street and down into our streets as well too, which is unaccounted for. Next slide, please. So another thing you'll see in natural soil, and something that does get changed very dramatically by urbanization development, is the horizonation or the layering of the soil. This is sort of what a natural soil would look like. One more click, please. Up at the top, we have our humus-rich, what we call A horizon. Down below that, we have our E, B, and C horizons. I'm not going to talk too much about them today. They are all important. All soil horizons are important. But in terms of the functioning of soil and the ability of soil to grow plants, it's the A horizon that is the most important, because that's what we refer to commonly as our topsoil. It's right there up at the top. It's got that nice dark brown, black color because it's chock full of organic matter, specifically soil humus. One more click. Interesting thing, even though this is the biological powerhouse of the soil, this is where the highest concentrations of bacteria and fungi and other microbes and other organisms, as well as the small feeder roots of the plants themselves. They mostly reside up here in the A horizon, or at least I should say mostly. The highest concentration is there in the A horizon. Our A horizons around here are fairly thin. A well-maintained soil might have 5-inch thick A horizon. That's pretty good for Virginia. 3 inches, 2 to 3 inches, I'd say, is more like your average. That's not bad. That's what we don't need more than that to grow healthy plants, to grow a suitable forest, a diverse forest. Our plants are accustomed to that thin A horizon, but it is interesting to think that soil is very important. It's a very important ecosystem, but it's really that top 3 to 5 inches that is the biological powerhouse of the soil, which is a problem in terms of development, because what's the layer that's going to be most affected by development? The one that's right near the surface, because that's the one that's going to get graded out, pushed around, shoved around, and compacted the most. In addition, it's going to get mixed in with all the other materials. So the reason that the A horizon is such a good habitat for organisms and for plant roots is that all the organic matter that's falling from the surface, as well as organic matter that gets exuded naturally through the roots of the plants, tends to concentrate right there because it's right there at the surface. So, the grass blades, the leaf fall in the fall, it's all kind of entering the soil right there where the grass is. And obviously it's very easy, just an inch or two down that it has to travel in order to get to the A horizon. If we start messing this up, though, we're going to start really degrading the health of the soil because, again, so much of the biological activity is concentrated right up there at the top few inches. One more click, please. This is where you're going to find these guys. Fine feeder roots, small arthropods. the bacteria, the fungi. It's not to say that you won't find these organisms if you go a little bit deeper, but you're not going to find them in that clayey B horizon below at the same concentration you will in the first couple of inches of the A horizon. Every teaspoon of healthy topsoil contains anywhere from about 100 million to 1 billion bacteria. Every teaspoon of healthy topsoil contains anywhere from about 40 yards to 40 miles of fungal roots. Those fungal roots are down there on the bottom left. They're like little white twines that work their way through the soil. Most of them are microscopic. A bunch of them wrap around each other, which they will. Sometimes they get big enough that you can see them. So if you lift off the leaves in a forest, sometimes you'll see these little white twine-like things working their way through those decomposing leaves. That's what we call mycelium, which are basically a whole bunch of fungal roots all wrapped around each other and making it big enough for us to see. And imagine 40, potentially up to 40 miles, those fungal roots per teaspoon of soil. That gives you an idea of how small they are and how numerous they are as well, too. And that's all happening up there in the A horizon, just in those top 4 or 5 inches of soil. Next slide. The real importance behind all these is that all these microbes and other critters in there are powering the soil food web. What is the soil food web? Everything has a food web. Everything gets eaten by something else and then excreted waste material is sort of recycled back in. The soil food web is that food web that's happening under our feet. And the base of the soil food web, one more time please, is our organic matter. That's the materials like the leaf ball, leaf litter, grass litter, stalks of dead plants, animal manures and stuff that get deposited on the surface, as well as the organic matter that gets exuded into the soil directly from the plant roots. That is the base of the organic matter, of the soil food web. And it's concentrated, again, right up there in the A horizon. Who is the first level of organisms to start breaking down that organic matter? It's our fungi and our bacteria. Those are sort of our lowest level consumers, if you will, our herbivores of the soil food web. The interesting thing about them is that we think of them as being so important, and they are, because they're breaking down that organic matter and eventually turning it into forms that are usable, releasing the nutrients into usable forms that can dissolve in the soil water and then be taken up by the plants. That's not why they're doing it. They're not doing it for the betterment of the world. They're just hungry. They're eating. And the reason they're eating is because they want to make more bacteria and more fungi. They want to reproduce. So when they eat this material, they're taking it into themselves. But luckily for us, when bacteria and fungi eat, they tend to concentrate a lot of the nutrients, especially nitrogen, in their body. And then these guys, they get eaten by other materials that are higher up in the soil food web. So your typical bacteria or fungi has a carbon and nitrogen ratio about 5 to 1 to 10 to 1, meaning fungi might have 10 parts carbon for every 1 part nitrogen inside its body, roughly. I'm sure it varies from species to species. We go up to the nematodes, the arthropods, the birds, the other things that might be eating some of these lower level critters. They generally have more of a 25 to 30 parts carbon to nitrogen in their bodies. What does this mean? Well, it means when they're eating bacteria and fungi, they're getting a lot more nutrients, a lot more nitrogen than we need, which is important because what do they do with that excess? They excrete it through their waste, basically through their manures. And that's then where the material becomes dissolved and available to the plants. So the bacteria and the fungi are basically important for extracting the carbon and the nutrients from that raw organic matter that gets deposited into the soil. And then the rest of the soil food web is important for eating those guys, getting an excess of nutrients in them and excreting the rest into a form that can be taken up by the plants. So the bacteria and the fungi are decomposers that kind of lump all the rest in sort of our nutrient liberators. They're the ones that sort of take that material and spread it out like crumbs into the soil where it can be accessed by the roots. Next slide, please. So what happens when this soil, with this nice A horizon up on top, 3 to 5 inches thick, gets developed? One more click, please. This causes that topsoil to get dispersed. Everything gets created and sort of homogenized, if you will. All the layers get sort of mixed together. The soil gets pushed up into a big stockpile on the side, and then it's brought back and spread out once all the structures are built and the final grade is being prepared. So you move from a nicely layered soil with that concentration of organic matter up in the topsoil, something that looks a little bit more like this. It's a bit hard to see. This is a picture from Loudoun County. You can see a little root barrier of geotextile fabric right there. Some odd colors in here as well, too. This is pretty much all fill. There's a very weak little A horizon up on top, but it's light. It's not dark. You can tell it doesn't have a lot of organic matter in there. It probably formed just from whatever little scrubby grasses that happened to grow on this lot after it was filled and developed. I'm not sure why they filled it, but it was. So you don't have that concentration of organic humus and organic matter there at the top. You don't have that when that organic layer gets mixed in throughout the rest of the soil. It disperses the organic materials, but it also disperses those billions and trillions of bacteria and fungi as well too. So they no longer have that concentrated source of nutrients around them. So they're going to be much less active. They're going to be much less effective at breaking down organic matter because they don't have the access to the organic matter. It's all dispersed everywhere. In addition, that's going to harm the plants as well too. So it's sort of a chicken and egg thing. One of the reasons we have so much concentrated organic matter up there is because we've got these nutrients that are, we've got these microbes that are liberating nutrients through the soil through web, providing it to the plants, which helps them grow big and tall. And then as they're growing, they're putting on new mass, new leaves, which fall and they decompose in the soil and they add more organic matter. And it becomes this nice virtuous cycle. But if you don't have the critters, the bacteria, the microbes and stuff living there, you're not going to have the nutrient cycling. If you don't have the nutrient cycling, the plants aren't going to have the nutrients they need. So they're not going to put on a lot of mass and they're not going to add that mass down to the soil. So you kind of need one or the other, or really both of them working together in order to get the soil healthy again. Unfortunately, when you disperse all that A horizon throughout, unless you come in with some actual interventions of your own, a lot of times that soil is going to stay for maybe decades and decades sort of marginally healthy. So again, how does this effective layering, homogenization, destruction of the soil horizons and soil layers during construction affect the soils that we were looking at in Arlington? So pick one time, please. The organic matter content is the first one. So again, we went from 1.7% organic matter in the first 4 inches, and we looked at the old soils, it was 3.5%. That's about a 50% decrease. So obviously you can see the effect of the A horizon being destroyed and dispersed. The topsoil depth is the other one too. We had about 1 inch of topsoil in our new soils versus 3 inches, about a 66% decrease from the old to the new properties. And really, almost we didn't have any topsoil in the new properties. What we had was a nice green sod that was freshly laid over urban soil, mixed up builder soil, if you will. And that topsoil that we were seeing was basically the organic matter that was stuck to the roots of the sod, which was brought in from somewhere else. You know, it came from a sod farm in rural Virginia or Maryland. They had A horizon there, they scraped up the sod, brought some of that A horizon with them attached to the roots, and they laid it back down. So that 1 inch of soil was really not the native topsoil. It was topsoil that was brought in by the sod. And we had basically the sod, a little bit of topsoil that was attached to its roots right on top of this marginal urban soil below. So really what happens when you greatly disturb your soil, when you do a major construction project, the construction of a new home, construction of a road, you're basically starting from scratch. You're starting your soil formation from scratch. Soil scientists consider soil formation to start when fresh parent material, when fresh sediment, fresh rock deposits, is placed somewhere and then begins to weather in place. Most of our soil around here forms from bedrock, so bedrock sits there for hundreds, thousands of years. It starts to break down through heating, cooling, shrinking, swelling cycles, and the like, freezing, thawing. And it creates sand, silt, and clay. It's a very slow process. It takes hundreds of years to create inches of soil. But you see new soil formation beginning in floodplains as well, too. We have a big flood, fresh sediment from that stream or river gets deposited on the floodplain. We consider that to be raw soil parent material. It hasn't become soil yet. It's basically just fresh raw material. It has to weather and form in place where it was deposited in order to be considered soil. And that's kind of like what's happening with our construction sites as well too. We had soil there before, but now we've sort of totally obliterated it. We've mixed up all the layers. We've dispersed all the organic matters and all the microbes. And now we're starting fresh. Next slide. So this is kind of what we're starting with. Luckily, it's not solid rock. We don't want to take 500 years to create good soil in our backyard. And we don't have to. We can go a lot faster than that. But we are kind of starting anew, if you will. We've got to recreate those soil layers, those soil horizons, recreate that A horizon and that good microbial ecosystem in order to get good plant growth on time. Next slide. So again, it's not unlike beginning soil formation to do. So what we have to ask ourselves is, we want to create healthy soil, which we had before. We have to basically become a proxy for Mother Nature. What does Mother Nature do in order to turn raw parent material in a floodplain or from eroded farm fields that deposit somewhere else into that highly layered A horizon with tons of organic material and living microbes and small feeder roots. How do we recreate that? How do we do what Mother Nature does? Next slide, please. Well, Mother Nature sort of works through these 4 soil forming processes. This doesn't tell you what you have to do, but this is telling you what the processes, the physical processes that you are trying to recreate as a land manager on a degraded piece of urban soil. We've got additions, we've got transformations, we've got translocations, and we've got subtractions. Additions are fairly obvious. It's new material added to the soil. An obvious one is organic matter. Again, think of all the leaf fall during autumn. That's a huge addition of new material to our soil. But root exudates are very important as well too. It's estimated that anywhere from about 10 to 40% of the photosynthetic output that a plant creates throughout the year is actually exuded into the soil and diffused into the soil through its roots. It's a tremendous amount. Tends to be a little bit higher for native grasses, a little bit lower for our bigger woody plants, but still, that's a lot. You think about even just 10%, the lower end of the range, 10% of all the new growth and mass that we see, all those leaves, that's a lot of stuff. 10% of that mass gets exuded right through the roots. That's a lot of direct input of organic matter. So there's a lot of additions throughout the year. Leaf fall, grass blades cut off the lawn, as well as those direct exudates from the roots, all being added into the soil as fresh organic matter. Once it's added in, new material starts to transform. Again, talking about organics, big transformation is that fresh raw organic matter through the decomposition process into humus. Bacteria and fungi start to eat it, decompose it, and turn it into soil humus. But there's other transformations occurring too. Some of them strictly physical. Sand will weather into silt and clay as well too. That's a very slow process. Not one that we can really affect too much. We can affect the organic matter decomposition transformation. Then we got translocations. Things move in the soil. Things don't stay in one spot. Why does the soil become layered? Well, clay tends to form up in the topsoil actually. But every time it rains, water passes through the little pores in the soil and it deposits, drives some of those clays deeper. And over many thousands of years, those clays begin to form that red Virginia clay that everybody shakes their fists about down in our subsoils. And then we have subtractions as well too. So not only are materials being added to the soil, they're being removed from the soil. Erosion is an obvious one. Sometimes that's human caused, sometimes it's natural. Leaching is another obvious one too. Sometimes human caused, sometimes natural. But every time water passes through the soil, soluble materials can get picked up, and some of it's going to be driven out of the soil and taken down into our deep ground. What can we do? Well, what we're really trying to do if we're trying to recreate soil is we kind of forget about the other 4 processes and we concentrate on additions. Additions is the thing that's going to get us back to our healthy soil. So concentrate on trying to recreate the additions that Mother Nature would be adding to your soil. And the way to do this, and this is more about management. So the soil forming processes are just the physical manifestation of how you manage your soil. If you want more additions, I think you can focus on the USDA's 4 principles of soil health. These things are really aimed towards commercial farmers, but what works in a farm field, it's going to work in your backyard as well too. There's no reason that biology doesn't change from one spot. The general principles don't change. So what are these 4 principles? The first one is we want to maximize the presence of living roots. Second one, we want to maximize biodiversity. Third, maximize soil cover. And the fourth, finally, different one, minimize something, minimize disturbance. So we want lots of living roots. We want a diversity of living roots. You want to maximize soil cover, meaning you want your soil covered at all times, whether that's through living roots or other materials. And you want to minimize the disturbance that you do to your soil. So basically set it and forget it, that kind of thing. Next slide, please. So let's go through those each one by one. How do we maximize the presence of living roots and why do we do that? Well, I kind of buried the lead a little bit. So the A horizon I mentioned is sort of the biological powerhouse of the soil. But it's really even more concentrated than that. And you're really looking at where the biology is. It's in a subsection of the A horizon called the rhizosphere. One more click, please. The rhizosphere is basically this little subset, subhabitat that's in very, very, very close proximity to the root. One more click. One more. There we go. So The rhizosphere is basically the near root environment, the buffer zone. Extends about 2 millimeters from the exterior of the root. It actually extends into the root a little bit too, because there's certain bacteria and fungi that can invade the root and live within the endodermis, the cortex, the epidermis, the outer layers of the root, basically. But the outer layers of the root and that 2 millimeter sheath of soil around the root, that buffer zone around the root, is your rhizosphere, your near soil, your near root environment. And this is really in the A horizon where you see the huge concentration of bacteria and fungi. And why is this? Remember that roots are always exuding organic material. And they do this in several different ways. At the front, you've got your root cap. That's sort of a finger that's pushing its way through the soil. Roots have to exert a lot of pressure to push through soil. Soil is, only 50% solid material, but it's hard. It's dense stuff. You got to force your way through. The root cap basically creates these sort of sacrifice cells on the front that slough off. And it sort of lubricates its pathway through. And it also sends out what we call mucilages, which is kind of what the word sounds like, mucus-like lubricating material out of the front. And it basically is a means of making the passage of that root a little bit easier, a little bit less rough through the soil. But as a result, this mucilage is an organic material. Those sloughed off root cap cells are organic material. So every time a root is pushing its way through the soil, it's leaving behind kind of a slimy coating of organic matter as well, too. In other parts of the root, there are other materials that are exuded out, sometimes purposefully. You hear about things like allelopathy. That's an organic compound that gets pushed out to push away rivals, if you will. But, not all of these things are necessarily bad. A lot of these are just materials that either leak purposefully or not purposefully out of the root, but they're organic materials. And as a result, they've got that carbon that the bacteria and fungi are looking for, and it gives them energy. So because there's all this good carbon-rich material leaking out of the root, you see a huge concentration of microbes right around the surface of the root too. The other thing that this does is as the root grows, it's helping to create pores in soil structure. Pore is fairly obvious. You get a root growing, it's burrowing through the soil. It's creating a tunnel through the soil. These little living feeder roots, they're constantly growing, dying back, growing and dying back. And what dies back, it leaves behind an open channel, an open pore space that now air and water can use to access the soil. It helps with soil structure too, because as the root pushes through, it compacts the soil a little bit on the side of that root channel. It causes the clay and organic matter that's already in the soil to sort of be smushed together a little bit, and this can cause them to stick together. In addition, we're exuding all this sort of sticky biological material out of the root that becomes a natural glue too, that helps glue the material on the root channel surface together to create sort of a little base nucleus, if you will, of those soil beds, those little soil aggregates. So over time, as thousands and thousands of these little feeder roots make their way through the soil, it really does help break up the soil, create new pore spaces, and create new soil aggregates or soil beds. Next slide. So what kind of plant would you want? Well, I would say go native. And the reason is, the bigger your root system, the bigger your rhizosphere is going to be. And the rhizosphere is where the biological activity of the soil is really concentrated and where the base formation of soil pores and soil structure is really occurring. The bigger roots you have, the more volume of soil will have those benefits. You've probably seen something very similar to this. Here's your Kentucky bluegrass. They've got very dense root systems, but they're very small and very shallow. They only extend a couple inches down into the soil. Whereas our little blue stems or other native prairie grasses or other just native plants, their roots are much more extensive. Because their roots are more extensive, the benefits of the rhizosphere are spread out over a much larger volume of soil. So that soil becomes rehabilitated over a much larger volume instead of that little 2 or 3 inch layer underneath your lawn plants. Next slide, please. So plant densely, plant native, and that's really the first of the soil forming, the USDA's soil health principles. Maximize continuous living roots because of all those benefits that the rhizosphere brings. So the more roots you have in your soil, the more extensive those roots are, the deeper and wider those root systems go, the more extensive the benefits of that rhizosphere will spread throughout your soil. And basically a larger, healthier A horizon you can over time recreate. Maximize biodiversity. So you don't want to just plant one thing. And again, these USDA principles are really geared towards farmers. And obviously farms have an issue with biodiversity because we tend to be a monocrop kind of culture. We plant 1,000 acres of corn, and then maybe we rotate it every now and then with soybeans or something else as well too, maybe some oats. But that's just one plant that's going in at one time, and that's just from the economic necessities of being a farmer. Obviously, things are a little bit different for suburban landscaper. You're probably not just planting one thing; you're probably planting several different things. So you generally have a bit more diversity than your average farm will have. But the more diversity you have, the better, because all plants have slightly different roots. They also have slightly different above ground mass as well too. Sometimes we have plants that have sort of this fibrous root system that's very typical of our native grasses. We have other plants that have more of this taproot style system where they have one big taproot and then some smaller feeder roots that go off to the sides as well too. Next slide, please. Our native trees are kind of in the middle. Basically, their root system kind of looks like a stream system or a river system. You sort of start at the trunk, that's kind of like the mouth of the river. You walk upstream, you find these big tributaries coming in. That's sort of like your buttress roots or your large lateral roots. And then from branching off of those large tributaries, we see smaller tributaries, which branch off into really small, ephemeral, intermittent streams. Those little small intermittent streams branch off the smallest little feeders of that stream. Those are like the absorbing roots, the active roots that are taking the oxygen, water, and nutrients from the soil. So it's sort of like a big branching system. Start large and branch smaller, smaller, and smaller, and smaller, and smaller. So you get this wide, extensive root system. But for the most part, our native trees and shrubs, they have a lot of roots, but they're fairly shallow. They tend to spread out fairly wide and not so deep. About 90% of roots of your typical forest species is going to be in the top foot of soil. Next slide, please. So with all these different types of plants, each plant will have a somewhat unique root system. Some of it will look like our trees. Some of it will have that more fibrous, grassy root system. Some of it will be a pure taproot, like a turnip or a radish. And each of these plants will have different exudates, different materials that it exudes through its roots down into the soil. Different surface litter as well, too. You're under a pine forest, the surface litter, those pine leaves tend to be very acidic. You go to a deciduous forest, you get obviously leaf fall. In the autumn, those tend to be a bit more basic. These all affect the soil in different ways. And when you affect the soil in different ways and you have a diversity of organic feedstocks going down into the soil will respond by having a diversity of microbes, bacteria, and other things, because there's specialists down there. There's some organisms that really like that acid soil. There's other organisms that like something a little more basic. There's some organisms like your fungi, which are really good at breaking down hard, resistant materials like logs. Think of all the fungi that you see growing on the side of a fallen tree log. Whereas bacteria are very good at breaking down sort of the softer, juicier materials like your fresh grass blades, your nitrogen-rich materials, and stuff like this. So basically, the more diversity you have above ground, in terms of the number and types of species of plants that you have, the more diversity in the microbial population you're going to have below ground too. What we see in any sort of ecological study is that more diversity equals more balance. When you have one of something, a monoculture, it's easy for bad bacteria, other disease-causing organisms to start spreading throughout that entire field because they only have to attack one thing. It's the only thing that's there. When you have a diversity of plants, you have a diversity of microbes, and it's very hard for any one of those microbes or plants, whether they're good or bad, to become dominant because they have to compete with all these other different ones and different feedstocks, which other materials might be a little bit better at breaking down than they are. So it gives you balance. Diverse inputs lead to diversity of soil fauna. Diversity above ground leads to diversity below ground. Next slide. And the more diverse fauna that you have in your soil, the more robust a soil food web is. You think of soil, any sort of food web as being kind of like a pyramid. The base is the most important. The base, the organic matter there, and just above it, the fungi and bacteria. If you have a big, robust, diverse base of organic matter, it's like your pyramid has a wider base too. Have a wider base, that pyramid can get much, much, much taller. Now again, a lot of these USDA principles are meant for farmers. So what they were saying is, don't just plant corn, don't just plant soybeans. Or if you are, then when you come in, have a cover crop in the winter. And if that cover crop can have a couple of different species like this farmer is using, that's going to help energize your soil between your cash crops. And we don't think of ourselves as farmers. We don't think of ourselves as monoculturists, but we really are. We're listening to Doug Hallam's speech, he would tell you to. Next slide, please. We do have a cover crop or a monoculture here, and that's the turf lawn. If you look at the Chesapeake Bay watershed, The largest crop acreage is lawn. Above corn, above soybeans, above any of our major commodity, commercially grown crops, it's lawn. So we do, in fact, have a lot of areas of monoculture here. And we can take some of those areas out of lawn and turn them into a diverse planting bed. What we would see is the diversity of the organisms living in the soil would explode. Next slide, please. The last two of the principles, soil health principles, I'm going to combine together because they really are they go hand in glove. When you're maximizing soil cover, you are in effect minimizing disturbance. And when you minimize disturbance, you're generally maximizing soil cover. And again, this was made for farmers, really. So when they were thinking, when USDA came out with these suggestions, these principles, when they were thinking of soil disturbance, they were thinking of something like this, the old word cloud, traditional farm tillage. Some of us might do a little bit of this if we have a garden crop and we put the rototiller out there in the spring to get a good seed bed started. But generally, as suburban landowners, urban landowners, we're not doing anything like this. But that doesn't mean that we're not disturbing the cover of the soil. We're not causing disturbance to our native soils. Next slide. The principle I have here, again, you're not necessarily going out with a plow, so it's not the same thing, but we are disturbing our surfaces quite a bit. The principle I have in mind is if nature dropped it, let it lie. That's sort of the best thing that you can do for your soil. Because if nature dropped it, that means that's a natural organic material that before this whole area was developed would have stayed on the soil surface, decomposed into soil humus as the result of the work of bacteria and fungi, and become part of that aerorizing in the soil. So how are we disturbing our soil? A lot of it's for aesthetic purposes, and it's this guy right here. He's sort of the main culprit, your old leaf blower. Some of us do it ourselves. I know I live in an HOA where we pay for leaf blowing in the fall. It drives me a little crazy, but I haven't quite gotten the gumption to work up that fight just yet. But when you're blowing leaves, certainly there's aesthetic benefits. People like to see the green grass. It makes things look neater. Sometimes you do have to blow leaves off certain areas. You leave too much leaf on your grass, it's going to come at it. It'll suffocate the grass. I see shaking his head. I'll get into some reasons why that may not be true, but I understand why people do blow. But what he's in effect doing is taking tons and tons of organic matter, sending it off site. Where does it go? Well, it usually goes to the curb. The vacuum truck comes and picks it up one Saturday out of the year, takes it to the landfill. They put it into a big pile, turns it into leaf mold, leaf compost, great stuff. And then people come and they bring their pickup trucks and they load their pickup trucks and they bring that stuff and they put it back on their soil. What a wasteful system. We could just leave it in place. And that's what we really should be doing if we want to get that organic matter as nature intended back down into the soil to reinvigorate our suburban A horizons. Next slide, please. And there's various ways to do this. You can leave leaves in place. If it's not a really, really thick mat, grass is probably going to be fine. But, if it is a really thick mat or you just don't like the look of it or you're worried about your grass, what you can do is, of course, break those leaves up and then use them as a mulch on areas that you don't mind being covered, your planting beds and things like that as well, too. More play. By leaving materials in place, we're allowing this huge input of natural organic matter and the nutrients that are associated with it to get back into our soil ecosystem. What else can we do? Well, this is a little bit controversial because I know a lot of people just want to leave the leaves in place because it's got a lot of larvae and other overwintering insects lying in them. But again, sometimes if you've got way too much leaves and you just don't know what to do with them and you want to see that grass, you don't have to rake them necessarily. What you can do is mow them. You mow them down till the leaves are about dime size. And usually you can do this with just one pass with a mulching mower, or two passes with your standard. It'll cut those leaves up into those little pieces. And then those leaves will settle down between the cracks because they've been chipped up into this much smaller size. And it's not going to lie on the surface and potentially smother the grass. It's going to migrate between the grass blades and sit there over winter, slowly decomposing the entire time, adding organic matter to your soil. What else can you do? Well, you can also just rake it into a pile and let it compost. Let it compost in your compost pile. And then come spring or summer, when this is ready, it's all chipped up, turned into nice dark leaf mold, good organic matter content, good moisture content. You can spread that over your garden bed. You can spread it over your planting beds as well, too. So there's a variety of ways to do it, and you just sort of have to work with what your aesthetics are, what your preference is. We don't want to force you necessarily just leave all the leaves right in place because that's not right for everybody. But if you can leave the leaves somewhere on your property and use them in a way that fits the ideal that you have for your landscaping, it's great. You're getting that organic matter, you're putting it back into the soil. Whichever way you do it, you're all getting that organic matter back in the soil. It's certainly better than having a company come and blow it or raking it to the curb and having the county come and pick it up. And of course, there's some people who if you just don't like leaves for whatever reason, it's not the end of the world. You can still keep your soil covered. You can buy mulch, you can buy other landscaping organic materials to cover your beds. This kind of maintains that nice aesthetic look that people like. It's still an organic material. Why do you have to keep buying new mulch? Because that mulch is slowly decomposing and becoming part of the soil. It doesn't have quite the concentration of nutrients that you're going to find in your leaf, just because it's hard woody material. And I think Jim will tell you that some of this stuff can turn into a dense mat at times as well too. So a lot of times we've been kind of pushing people towards more of that arborist chipped up mulch to get when a tree is taken down. This tends to not turn into that mat. But still, this is protecting the soil. It's providing some thermal insulation as well too. And it is an organic material that's preventing that soil from eroding and is slowly decomposing and adding organic matter to the soil. So no matter which way you do it, all these things have their benefit. I would say the best is just leave everything where it is. But of course, we do have to take into consideration what people actually want from their landscape and how they want their landscape to look. So all of these methods will help you get that organic matter back down into the ground. Next slide. Now, there are some extreme examples. So there are some cases where you do have to intervene, if you will. All the other things I was talking about were basically how do you harness natural processes, maybe speed them up a little bit, but how do you harness those natural processes to decompact your suburban soil and recreate that egg horizon and that healthy microbial ecosystem and soil food web. Well, let's say you have a backyard it's a brand new construction and that soil is hard as a rock. Obviously, heavy machinery has gotten over it. You just got a little bit of sod on top of what is in effect concrete. Well, you're going to have to take things into your own hands a little bit more. Or let's say you have a big patio or something like that you want to rip up and turn into a planting bed. Soil under that patio is going to be really, really dense, and you probably won't be able to plant right into it without doing some interventions first. What we see with these general, more intense soil remediation, severely compacted urban and suburban soil, is it's a physical project. You basically have to rip up the soil. You do have to do some tilling and some plowing. You don't do it with your traditional mold board plow, though. You do it with something like this, which is called a subsoiler. A subsoiler is basically a plow that kind of consists of these deep 24-inch or so tines or sites, if you will. It's sort of like you're the Grim Reaper going through and sweeping up your soil. That gets attached to the back of a tractor, and the tractor drags that material through the soil, and it kind of shatters and breaks up the soil to about 18 or 24 inches of depth, loosens it up, and gets rid of that compaction. You can do it with a rototiller as well, too. A rototiller is, even a big one like this, is not going to give you the depth of soil decompaction that a subsoiler will, but it is something that you can push with your own two hands, whereas that you need some sort of tractor in order to pull it along. And the issue with this is, while there's plenty of companies out there that will offer this service, you have a quarter-acre lot, you're going to get a 50-yard pass of that tractor, and then they're going to have to turn around and go back, and it's just not practical. We don't have the size of property necessary in many cases for this to be an actual viable alternative. You've got bigger acreage, and it is quite possible. So there's another method that is being put out by Virginia Tech. Next slide, please. It's called the soil profile rebuilding. And this is actually what is now required in Arlington County. So it's somewhat as a part of the study that we did for them. They have now put in place requirements for new houses in Arlington. That when you build this new house, before it can come off bond, before it can be sold to the first owner, you actually have to come in and decompact the soil using the soil profile rebuilding method. And again, this is something that came out of Virginia Tech's Agriculture and Natural Resources School. What is soil profile rebuilding? Basically, you take the site where everything has just been compacted, a freshly constructed lawn, if you will. You add 4 inches of compost, and then you use the backhoe, which is probably on site already for the construction. And you do what's called the scoop and dump method. Take the bucket of that backhoe, you scoop down to the depth of the bucket, which is usually about 18 or 24 inches. You lift that material up, and now it's a mix of the compost that you laid on top and the really compacted soil below. Lift it about 3 or 4 feet above the ground, and then you drop it. What happens is this naturally mixes the compost and the compacted soil together, but it also causes that compacted soil to shatter. As it hits the ground, it sort of breaks up into smaller pieces. So you're basically just potholing the soil. You do this a couple thousand times.
Sorry,
making these
scoop
holes.
and dump. you
Scoop
said?
and dump, yep. And what it doesn't create an even mix of compost throughout the soil. What it does is it creates kind of deep veins of compost that now oxygen and water can use to get several feet down into the soil. After you've done all the scooping and dumping, they say 4 inches of topsoil on top, rototill that in, so you do get that good seedbed on top, and you get kind of a connection between those deep veins of compost and that rototill topsoil on top, and then you plant. And what we find is that it's not a perfect recreation of natural soil, but it really does do a lot of these specific functions that natural soil will do. And it can save money in the long run because the plants grow so much better in this healthier soil than trying to get, expensive bulb and burlap soil, burlap specimen tree to grow in this really compacted urban stuff. I think on the next slide, I have a video. Okay. And this is Arlington County crew using urban soil profile we're building on the health strip between the sidewalk and the roadway. So they've already laid out the 4 inches of compost. It's going in, the scooping. See him bring it up and drop it. Give it a little shake, and then you go on to the next bucket. He's evening it out a little bit. That's all it really is. Now, this is a lot of work. If you're going to do this, so you might want to start small in this. If you have a strong bag and a good couple hours or a good couple weekends to spare, you can do this yourself. It's going to be a lot of work. You can find these excavators at rental places, but if you're really motivated, you can do sort of a lighter version of this with a pickaxe or a pickmatic. Your back will be sore at the end of the day, especially if you have really compacted soil. But there's no reason that you can't try and do it yourself as well too. I would start very small. If you're thinking of converting part of your lawn to a native bed, you try and do this. And the nice thing is the full specification is free up on Virginia Tech's website. So you can go there, download it, soil profile rebuilding, and see if it works for some of the most problematic parts of your lawn. Next slide, please.
Richard driving the heavy machinery to the location.
That's why I wouldn't do it unless you really, really need it.
He drove on the road. Yeah.
It's also very
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. He's got a nice street there.
I have a quick question. Have
Yep.
you ever used the broad fork? Is that a useful tool for this?
I have not, but I haven't tried to do something like this myself yet. So there is certainly room for experimentation.
Have you tried it?
We have one at George Mason University. We've used it occasionally. It works pretty good. It's a broad fork. Allows you to stand on it to drive the tines in.
Signs are like
That was my last one.
And then you have two big levers to put your whole weight to drive the tines through the soils. So then you turn the soil, it just breaks it up.
Breaks it up. Yeah.
A broad fork.
A broad fork. Okay.
That sounds like it would work. I was thinking either just a Bigmatic, but yours probably you get a little more leverage with that, so it's
Yeah.
a little easier.
Yeah.
You need a lot
that
of
was
body weight to
that was my
do
last slide, and I know we're getting close to the 11:30 time, but it's there. Any questions? Yes, Sally.